Hello, and welcome to your next math lesson. Today's math lesson is called Represent Decimals. Now, if you haven't already, go ahead and pause this video, get a piece of paper and a pencil so that you can take notes as we go through this lesson. Represent decimals. In today's lesson, we are going to be converting base 10 fractions into decimal numbers. So first of all, what's a base 10 fraction? Well, a base 10 fraction is any fraction that has a power of 10 as its denominator. A power of 10 is any number that starts with 1 and ends in 0. So 10 is a power of 10, 100 is a power of 10, 1,000 is a power of 10, 10,000 is a power of 10, and so on. Those are all powers of 10. So that means a base 10 fraction is any fraction that has one of these numbers as its denominator. Again, in a fraction, the top number is the numerator and the bottom number is the denominator. So if the bottom number is 10, let's say it's 2/10, or if the bottom number is 100, it could be 5/100, then that's a base 10 fraction. Again, because its denominator is a power of 10, any number that starts with in a 1 and then has zeros after it is a power of 10. Okay, moving on. Before we start changing fractions into decimals, let's talk about decimal numbers a little bit. You already know that numbers have a ones place. Let's say this number has a 7 in the ones place, and numbers have a tens place. Let's say this number has a 2 in the tens place, and there's a hundreds place. We could make this number have a 3 in the hundreds place. Well, we also know that numbers can go on forever to the left. After the hundreds place, you could add a thousands place, then a 10,000s place, then a 100,000s place, then a millions place, then a 10 millions place, then a 100 millions place, and so on. It keeps going. Numbers never stop. They can always get bigger and bigger. But maybe you didn't know that just like numbers can go forever to the left and get bigger and bigger, numbers can also go forever to the right, and they can get smaller and smaller. So what we do to make it so that numbers can keep getting smaller and smaller or keep getting broken up into smaller and smaller pieces is we have a decimal point. And what that decimal point does is it separates the ones place from all the decimal place values. So directly to the right of the ones place, we have what's called the tenths place. Directly to the right of that, we have what's called the hundredths place. Notice it has a sound at the end. And directly to the right of that, we have the thousandths place. Notice it has that at the end. It's not the thousands place, it's not the hundreds place, and it's not the tens place. It's the tenths place, the hundredths place, and the thousandths place. So why would this be called the tenths place? Well, you know that numbers get 10 times bigger. Each place value represents 10 times more than the one to its right as you move over to the left. Well, they get 10 times smaller as you move to the right. So the tenths is 10 times smaller than the ones place. And that makes sense because if you have 1/10 of something, that's 10 times smaller than 1, because a tenth means you have one thing that's broken up into 10 equal parts. So let's say this number has a 4 in the tenths place, a 5 in the hundredths place, and a 6 in the thousandths place. Now, we already know that the value of this 7 in the ones place would just be 7 because it's 7 ones, which is 7. The value of this 2 in the tens place would be 20 because it's 2 tens. 2 tens is 20, and the value of this 3 in the hundreds place would be 300 because it's 3 hundreds, and 3 hundreds would be 300. What's the value of the 4 in the hundredths place? It's 4 I'm sorry, I said hundredth place, I meant to say tenths. What would the value be of the 4 in the tenths place? It would be 4 tenths. It's 4 tenths. Therefore, you write it as the fraction 4 over 10, or 4 tenths. What would the value be of the 5 in the hundredths place? It's 5 hundredths. It's 1/100th 5 times. Therefore, it's 5 hundredths. So you write it as 5 over 100, or 5 hundredths. And the 6 in the thousandths place would be 6 out of 1,000 equal parts, or 1/1000ths 6 times. So it's 6 thousandths, or 6 over 1,000. Okay? Now that we know that decimal place values move to the right and they represent place value positions that get smaller and smaller, now we're ready to start changing to start changing fractions into decimal numbers. So I'm going to erase what we have so far. You won't have to erase it because you should have a lot more room on your paper than I do. Now, we're only changing fractions into decimals. We're only changing fractions that have powers of 10 into decimals. We're not getting into changing just any old fraction into decimals. Today, we're only doing base 10 fractions. So let's say we have 7 tenths. How do we change 7 tenths into a decimal? Well, you can see it's 7 out of 10. So if we were going to write a decimal number here, we have our tenths place here, our thousandths place here. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Our tenths place here, our hundredths place here, and our thousandths place here. Here we have our ones place. Remember, the decimal number separates the ones place from the tenths place. This is 7 tenths. Therefore, the 7 goes in the tenths place. And there is no whole number here, so there's a 0 in the ones place. And that's how you would write 7 tenths as a decimal number. Let's do another example. Let's say we had 8 hundredths. Here, the 8 is over 100. Therefore, the 8 would go in the hundredths place. This is tenths, hundredths, then thousandths. There's nothing in the tenths place, so we put a 0. And there's nothing in the ones place, so we put a 0. And that's how you'd write 8 hundredths as a decimal. Let's do another example. Let's say we had 52 hundredths. It's 52 over 100. Therefore, the last digit of 52, which is the 2, would go in the hundredths place. And the 5 goes in the tenths place. There's nothing in the ones place. Therefore, there's a 0 in the ones place, and it's 52 hundredths. Now, another way that you can know that this is 52 hundredths is 52 hundredths is the same thing as 50 hundredths plus 2 hundredths. 50 hundredths plus 2 hundredths is 52 hundredths. Well, 50 hundredths is the same thing as 5 tenths. Because as long as you get rid of a 0 in the numerator, you can get rid of a 0 in the denominator too. So this is 5 tenths plus 2 hundredths. And here we have 5 tenths. Here we have 2 hundredths. If this part doesn't make sense to you, you don't need to worry about it though. That's just kind of a little extra. Let's do another example. Let's say we had 38 thousandths. We have 38 over 1,000. Since it's over 1,000, the last digit in 38 would go in the thousandths place, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. And the 3 in 38 goes right next to it in the hundredths place. There's nothing in the tenths place, so we put a 0, and there's nothing in the ones place, so we put a 0 there too. And this is how we'd write 38 thousandths as a decimal. And that's all you have to do in today's lesson is take fractions and turn them into decimal numbers. Let's just do a couple more examples together. Let's do 4/10. We'll change that into a decimal. We'll change 9/100 into a decimal, and we'll change 82 thousandths into a decimal. How do we change 4/10 into a decimal? 4/10 would equal, we know it's over 10, so we know it's going to go into the tenths place. Our decimal point separates the ones place from the tenths place. Since 4 is over 10, the 4 goes in the tenths place. There's nothing in the ones place, so it gets a 0. Next, the 9 is over 100. Therefore, this number is going to need a hundredths place. We know the decimal point separates the ones place from the tenths place. Okay, it's 9 hundredths, so the 9 will go in the hundredths place. There's nothing in the tens place. There's nothing in the ones place. That's how you'd write 9 hundredths as a decimal. So this and this equal the same thing. This is 82 thousandths. It's 82 over 1,000, so this number is going to need a thousandths place position. We know the decimal point separates the ones place from the tenths place. To the right of the tenths place is the hundredths place. To the right of the hundredths place is the thousandths place. 82 is over 1,000, therefore the last digit over to the right in 82 goes in the thousandths place position. The 8 goes next to it, it's 82. So the 8 ends up in the hundredths place. There's nothing in the tenths place. There's nothing in the ones place. That's how you'd write 82 thousandths. One last thing in this lesson is, how do we write all these numbers in word form? In a previous lesson, we learned that every number has its standard form, its word form, and its expanded form. How would we write 4/10 in word form? And the answer is, we write it the exact same way that we say it. So whether it's a fraction or whether it's written as a decimal, we say 4/10. That's exactly what we write. 4/10. This is 9 hundredths, whether it's written like this or like this, we say it the same way, 9 hundredths. So that's how we write it, 9 hundredths. This is 82 thousandths. Whether it's written in fraction form or in decimal form, we say it the same way, 82 thousandths. So that's what we write, 82 thousandths. Okay, that's today's lesson. Today's lesson is on representing decimals by changing base 10 fractions into decimal numbers. We will catch you next time. Signing off.